we'll start the session. So I am Keith. I am a charity lawyer and a governance specialist with Counterculture. I'm sorry we're not in person, but this is Sheffield, and I'm glad we've got the technology to host this kind of really important discussion at this time. We've been asked to describe what you're seeing on the video, and so I'm Keith. I'm a white man, not much hair, lots of glasses, wearing a white shirt in my study. I'm going to hand over to Zoe. You might already know Zoe from her work as the Associate Director of the Freedom Theatre of Palestine. You might have been reading her pieces in the stage, or you might have seen her work at places like the Old Vic. I know she's been at COP26. I'm hoping to hear a bit more about that, but cultural resistance as a heading is a really broad subject. So Zoe, where would you like to start?
Probably. I've never had a piece on at the Old Vic, but don't worry.
Young Vic, I've seen you somewhere around there.
Young Vic, not Old
Young
Vic.
Vic. Ah, that's where I've seen you.
Announced as the artistic director of the Old Vic. So.
Oh well, go for it. It must be true.
I'm used to this confusion, but I feel I have to be honest.
Yeah,
so right, describe myself. I am white. I've got blonde hair. Maybe not entirely natural, sort of bluey, grey, green eyes, depending. I'm in a corner of my room, very clearly sort of crafted to not show the chaos going around. And I'm wearing a sort of blouse, I suppose. Well, that makes me sound like I'm from the 1950s, and sort of a black denim something. Anything else, Keith?
No, that's lovely.
That's enough description.
That's enough of that. But no, let's get to some resistance.
Great. So I will crack on, but just to give a pre-warning, in order to sort of be able to articulate what I want to say and collect thoughts, especially in a time of like quite a lot of exhaustion after COP, I've written quite a lot of stuff down. It's in 3 parts, and I might get to the 3rd part and just throw it out the window and me and Keith can chat, but let's see. So I'll jump into that. Please feel free to interrupt if anything's not clear. I'm not going to wear a headset because I have a tendency to bash the mic with enthusiasm, which is just really irritating to listen to. This September, at the same time I was asked to do this talk for Claw Leadership, 3 situations were unfolding in my life. Firstly, the co-founder of the theatre I'd worked in for the last 12, 13 years, and who had spent his life fighting for his land and human rights, had escaped out of a high security prison where he was being held as a political prisoner and was on the run. Secondly, I was going through an intense burnout and stepping back from a large proportion of creative projects I was working on, due to coming to the end of my ability to manage exploitative and discriminative and extractivist processes of working and their power dynamics, which had got increasingly worse during the pandemic. And thirdly, I was preparing for COP26. And as some of you who might have been hearing what me and Keith were discussing, it was less an official invite and more to be outside on the streets with radical activists, artists, and in general, misfits. I'm going to attempt to talk about all 3 of these today, one by one. So part 1, radical leadership and Zachariah. Part 2, our working systems and the system change that I think is needed. And part 3, COP and being on the streets and looking at collective solidarity. And I think sort of cultural resistance really underpins all 3 of these. And sometimes I'll tie this into the climate crisis and arts, and sometimes I just might not. So first, let's start with radical leadership and Zachariah Zubeidi, a man who, for me, both exemplifies this and is an important figure in the fight against colonialism, land and human rights, and who pioneered, at least for me and the team I work with, the idea of cultural resistance. So to touch briefly on the context I'm coming from, I've worked for the last 12, 13 years in Jenin refugee camp in the north of Palestine at the Freedom Theatre, a place that fights for liberation from colonialism using arts. The principles of this theatre evolve around freedom for Palestinians from occupation, right of return for refugees, and a wider belief in liberation for all people away from oppression, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, patriarchy, homophobia, and on and on. There was two co-founders for the Freedom Theatre, Giuliano Mercamis, an actor and director, who I won't focus on today, but also exemplifies radical leadership to the extent he gave his life in the fight for Palestinian freedom, murdered outside of the theatre a week after the final show of an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland that we co-directed together. Zachariah Zubeidi is the other co-founder, far less talked about in Western settings as he is the leader of the Alexa Martyr Brigade in Jenin camp, the armed Palestinian resistance, leading a small and under-equipped refugee camp against invasion from one of the largest armies in the world. His actions and commitments epitomize for me the fight for life in a context of extreme violence. Context is everything. So to go through Zachariah's context, he was born in 1976 under Israeli occupation in Jenin refugee camp. He has therefore never experienced life as a free person, never lived in safety. His father died as a child and he worked in construction in Haifa, a contradiction that often befalls Palestinians, that in order to survive aggressive poverty, you end up working to build the state of your oppressor. Life did not get easier. In his own words, one of my first memories was waking up with bullet wounds when I was 13 and a half. At 14, I was imprisoned. With its invasions, tanks, and explosions, the occupation destroyed my childhood. During the Second Intifada, Zachariah's mother and brother were killed, and Jenin camp was invaded and bulldozed to the ground in an offensive that lasted 10 days. Zachariah survived the massacre and subsequently rose up to the ranks of the Alexa Martyr Brigade, the armed wing of the Fatah movement, to become its leader, thus topping the list of Israelis' most wanted Palestinians. In 2004, he told the journalist Gideon Levy, "I am dead. I know that I am dead." But somehow he lived, and with the Palestinian resistance decimated and many fighters killed or imprisoned, Zachariah considered a new path of cultural resistance and the art of telling your story. So in Zachariah's words, the Second Intifada is in death throes. These are the final stages. Not only was the Intifada a failure, but we are a total failure. We achieved nothing in all these years of struggle. We've achieved only our survival. These weapons, if they are not packed with values and politics and real honest leadership, liberation leadership, I don't want to fight anymore. We must build up this leadership from scratch. And to do this, the best way is to start an artistic venue, the Freedom Theatre. What we are trying to do is to fix the damage of the occupation for a whole generation, culturally and morally, and trying to put the Palestinian cause into the eyes of the world. It is a message that there's a Palestinian people that exists and is living under occupation, and it is in need of freedom. Through the theatre, just the last thing he said, through the theatre you can talk to the world and give a different message, different from the way they see us as terrorists. And so together with Giuliano, they built the Freedom Theatre, a 400-seater venue. It's got a multimedia department and also a school that trains people in pretty much every single arts field. The mission was to both build back Palestinian identity, destroyed by years of brutal occupation, and to tour the often unheard first-hand experiences of Palestinians to the international community, counteracting the intense media propaganda that delegitimizes the Palestinian right to life. And after a few years of work, Giuliano and Zachariah's radical vision began to take effect and have ripples both locally in the camp, across Palestine, and also internationally. In 2011, Giuliano, myself, and a team of people from both the camp, Palestine and outside, created Alice in Wonderland, a radical adaptation with a revolutionary message, challenging dictatorship, patriarchy, corruption, and Israeli military occupation, that played to sold-out houses for roughly 6 weeks. A week after the shows had finished on the 4th of April, Giuliano was murdered outside the venue, and our moment of triumph turned upside down into a nightmare, beginning a 10-year battle to keep the theatre's doors open, with Zachariah continuing to play a key role, even as he was being repeatedly imprisoned and attacked from all sides. In the aftermath of Giuliano's death, worldwide media attention meant a circus of journalists descended on the theatre. People from outside were quick to use his death to voice their own opinions and political beliefs. Most destructive was the headlines that insinuated it was an Islamic extremist from the refugee camp who had murdered him. An accusation that, if you understand the fabric of society, makes it near impossible. However, both the Israeli army, the Palestinian Authority, used this as an excuse to attack the refugee camp, further isolating the theatre from the society it was fighting for. Zachariah, who had lost yet again another friend, fighter, and comrade, took an important but difficult stance. From the mosque, he announced that Giuliano was a martyr, an honor held normally only for people who lost their lives as armed freedom fighters. It was a small but mighty act, cementing the importance of culture in the fight for liberation and life, and the importance the Freedom Theatre and its team played in this struggle. Once again, his validation of cultural resistance was no easy stance, but it gave us the legitimacy to continue. Zachariah played a much more hands-on role in the coming months after Giuliano's death. He did not know how to direct or perform productions, but he knew how to keep a team focused on its mission and its importance. When death threats started to arrive, invasions from the Israeli army and arrests, and many of he never pressured you into feeling that you must continue, but simply reassured you if you chose to, made you feel protected and safe without creating an illusion that what we were doing wasn't dangerous. He helped each of us maximize our potential in a moment of complete chaos. None of us were born leaders, but with Giuliano's murder, Zachariah created an environment and gave us the confidence to pick up the mantle and continue his legacy. Zachariah has gone on to inspire, fight, and support a generation of artists. He has also met each new obstacle, threat on his life, or imprisonment with a diversity of tactics, from armed resistance to hunger strikes, advocating for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and of course, building a very successful cultural venue. Zachariah maintains that the concept of cultural resistance does not stand in opposition to armed resistance or any other kind of resistance, a way of thinking that is deeply embedded in the context of violence he experiences as a Palestinian on the front line of environmental and human rights struggle. So often, for those of us who live our lives in relative safety, we preach non-violent resistance in our social and political movements. But the reality in Jenin camp is that armed uprising is crucial to survival. And by delegitimizing that right, you're effectively gaslighting the context of extreme violence. In Zachariah's words, I burst open the lock to the theatre with the butt of my machine gun. You can't separate armed resistance from cultural resistance. Moving on in the present day, on the 6th of September, we woke to the news that Zachariah, using a spoon, had dug himself out of a maximum security prison that he'd been held in for 2.5 years without charge. Once again, by facing risk directly, and despite immense power imbalance, he managed to set himself free, defy brutal colonial oppression, and not only for his friends and colleagues at the Freedom Theatre, but for a whole nation, ignite a renewed sense of resistance through radical leadership, innovation, and spontaneity. Okay, so that's part one. I'm just going to take a tiny sip of water. I don't know, Keith, if there's anything you want to ask at this stage.
I think for me, it's an incredibly powerful story, isn't it? And it's an honour and a privilege to kind of hear it from you as someone who's been involved and seen it. I guess for me, it's then, first off, how do you look after yourself when you're faced with that kind of situation? When you've got that kind of role within a theatre space, with all of that happening around it, how do you look after yourself?
I think the honest answer is that people don't.
Right.
I have the privilege of being British, of a British passport, and I work there part-time, and I very deliberately structure my life so I'm not permanently there, because the burnout is very real. And personally, once I get to that stage, I stop being able to think, be productive, be positive. So I design my life like that. For others, that's not a reality that is possible. The current artistic director, who's an incredible person, an activist, an artist, very openly, and it's quite a taboo, talks about mental health and his mental health, and what decades and generations of living in a context of extreme violence does to your mental health. But I think it's really important. This isn't post-traumatic stress disorder or some label that you could give it, because that's ongoing. And the reality is that you have to deal with that with a certain level of, I don't know how to say it, about beyond like toughness, because it's not going away. And I think that does do really long-term damage, but people don't have a choice. And I found it very interesting when we've started to have this conversation around mental health in the UK, and I've definitely done pieces about that. That conversation is not afforded to Palestinians, and that's, part of many things that we give ourselves maybe in the UK, but it's not given. And so, yeah.
Fascinating. We could spend hours just reflecting on that, but I guess we take that as an experience and say, well, what do we do to change the system?
I'm going to talk about system change next, but I'm going to leave the context of Palestine behind and really look at the UK, which occasionally as a British person, I do have to. Okay, so we're in a crisis in the UK, a pandemic crisis, a climate crisis, a capitalist crisis, a crisis of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, class discrimination, and on and on. Artists have the skills to help in the multiple battles that need to happen in order to achieve social and political justice and change, put out a planet on fire and begin to heal. But how can artists give a positive or healthy contribution to the huge systematic change that must happen at this 11th hour, when the toxic systems we work in are simply a micro to this macro? It feels selfish to focus on ourselves in such an urgent time. Ludicrous to put together in the same talk the struggle of art workers in the UK next to the struggle for Palestinian liberation. But our working environments are failing, and it is suffocating the possibility that we can be agents for change. It is closing the door to the most important voices, if they were ever open in the first place. There is much talk in arts of sustainability, shifting to a way of making theatre that is carbon zero. But this seems futile when the wider system change that is needed goes far beyond whether we continue to use paper flyers or if we recycle material for the set. I'm not undermining those things, they're really important, just to emphasize, but I think we must first address the deep systematic issues in our own working lives, or we will simply perpetuate these exploitative and abusive practices we claim to fight. If we want to know how cultural organizations will truly deal with the climate crisis, we simply have to look at the crisis we just had. Coming out of the pandemic, I am exhausted. It's more than just the everyday survival, community organizing, childcare, the death. I have spent a year and a half running to keep up with an industry whose main demand and value system models itself on generating product. To create output, even if that has to change with every new rule and regulation, each new corona case, every new lockdown or freedom day. It does not matter what is going on. We must deliver stuff, regardless of whether there is any added value, whether anyone wants it or needs it, and what contribution it's giving beyond a small moment of recognition and proving we are here. The way arts and culture are framed in the capitalist society requires from us constant production of final objects for consumption. This extractivist model that exploits, exhausts, and spits out destroys the people at the center of it and creates a structure that is not only only really survivable for people with safety nets and those who have their own support networks, and who are also not having to navigate any of life's blows and brutalities. Corona proved in both arts and beyond that far from putting to one side capitalist models of exploitation, crisis excels them. And as we move into the full throes of a climate crisis, we must consider the role of artists beyond tired tropes of capitalist making and production. Again, we cannot just regurgitate the same systems in art that are killing people in life. We have the evidence how cultural organizations, much like governments and corporations, will deal with its workers in a crisis, because we just experienced it. Corona saw, at best, a practice that disregarded and devalued its vulnerable workforce, and at worst, moved into a model of disaster capitalism. The firing in staff, including ushers already on 0-hour contracts, only to hire them back in worse contractual situations. Clamping down on clauses, for example, force majeure, also phrased as acts of God, that allow a freelancer no protections in the most vulnerable moments. Removal of any health protection, including refusal to take out insurance on behalf of artists. A requirement to put our own and others' lives in danger in order to make work. And if we get sick, we are simply fired. Workers being asked to pay back their furlough contributions. 60% of women considering leaving theatre. increase in racial discrimination, sexism, transphobia, homophobia. This list goes on and on. The general response is always, at least when I ask, industry practice, which confirms that this is not just a few rotten apples or the occasional malpractice, but an accepted system. I'll briefly touch on a project called Reshape that I worked on across 3 years, which was funded by major foundations, including British Council, Goethe Institute in Germany, ONDA in France, and lots of others. And I cannot say this without slightly laughing. Our aim was reshaping the cultural ecosystem, which we did very earnestly as best we could. The goal of the trajectory I was working on was to give answers to the value of art in the social fabric. And I'm not going to lie, I spent largely 3 years just trying to get my head around what that meant. It was an opportunity to understand more about our vast field of socially and politically engaged arts. And it was a chance to shake things up and challenge things and provoke and be a bit reactive, which personally I love doing. We started by listing hundreds of issues from large scale, for example, the silencing and censorship of certain artists, borders, murder, to small issues, for example, the relentless need to be on social media to promote our artist profiles and to get work recognized. It was important to identify as many problems as we could and sort of take away the judgment that some issues felt small and silly compared to like huge and very brutal things. We captured our findings using 2 concepts, 2 metaphors that can carry the fragments of knowledge. The first one is a home, a large virtual community space for everyone in the arts world who dreams of social change, a place for safety, fairness, and inclusion. In this, we largely asked questions. And it was not about trying to have a final outcome or product, but begin to build a platform and what we can consider might be the next steps. The second one was a suitcase, a minuscule piece of personal space that people take with them when they need to leave their home, often in order to survive. And that was created, that part of it was very much created by a Libyan Tamazight artist called Tiwa, who at every stage of this project was facing borders, her home being bombed, and just sort of all sorts of horrendous things. The consistent findings for why these issues were there and not being addressed included obvious things like money and time, as well as a lack of imagination, alternative experiences, vulnerability, and that people simply benefit from how things are, so don't have the will to change them. But lastly, and maybe most interestingly, a key focus in running cultural organizations or foundations from top-level management, and I include boards, and I am on a board, so this is also self-criticism, is risk mitigation, that decisions are largely made in order to protect. But the irony is we're fucked. Whether it's our cultural ecosystems, our economy, our democratic structures, our health, or the climate crisis, it's not going well. And by simply focusing on models that work to risk avoid, we are walking into complete irrelevance as artists in times of crisis. In the case of Zachary Zubeidi and the Freedom Theatre, it has always been about embracing risk, seeing where it is and grabbing it, and seeing where that takes us. And that has been to a place of innovation, cultural uprising, resistance, and wins in completely impossible circumstances. Yes, it has also been to great personal cost, including death, as I mentioned, prison, torture, the recent loss of 85% of core funding, the collapse of friendships and families, And I know I'm probably not selling this very well, but this is the reality in the fight for life and the stakes that this moment requires of us. This is the core of what is meant by cultural resistance. Concepts that are much easier to understand when we say freedom fighter and less so artist. So maybe it's time to let the house collapse and let those who spend their lives working outside of mainstream systems, deeply embedded in social or political movements, community organizing, uprisings, let these people lead, let them build it back, not out of niceness or, I don't know, white guilt, but because what needs to happen is complex, and we must be ready to trust people whose vision is not that of the status quo, whose lived experience forms their decision-making, like Zachary Zubeidi, who can make bold decisions as an artistic leader because of his life experience, his background, and because his community deeply trust him. The hope at the beginning of the pandemic was to rethink, reimagine, remodel, but that was quickly crushed. But I don't think that means there isn't hope. And I think, and maybe Keith, we can go into this, some of what, not all of it, but some of what was happening outside of this on the streets at COP is really positive models.
I think that kind of positive modelling is kind of a lovely place to land, isn't it? After that, because I guess the risk is that we all act like the scared rabbit in the headlights, and we hear and feel, deeply that kind of risk to art and artists, but don't have the tools or the experience to then tackle the underlying themes that you're starting to explore here. Do you find hope by looking at a younger generation? Is that where we start?
I think I find moments of extreme hope, and it's really exciting. I think that a lot of the things that maybe have been fought for a long time, the younger people are enacting on. But I'm also very wary at the same time that, some of actually the biggest Freedom Theatre supporters in the US are people who were part of the civil rights movement. And I think it's this, we need to also acknowledge and learn from all those things that have come before. So I think it's both. And I'm also, I work a lot with young people, and in all sorts of situations and circumstances. And sometimes I think that the pressure, I love it when they fight and what they're doing, but also sometimes I think it's deeply unfair. And I feel that when I was with younger activists who were doing incredible things outside COP. I mean, there was a group of young people I was with, and they basically just relentlessly went to events, dressed up. We all dressed up in snazzy clothing and went to NatWest Bank's event on institutional activism, and they disrupted it. And then we'd go to, conglomerates events on women CEOs and female leadership, and they disrupt it and call this stuff out, and then lock-ons outside billionaires' dinners, and they were just relentless. But I also think it's part of that is fun and exciting and really actually quite mentally stimulating, because it is about thinking about new ways of doing things in terms of, let's say, non-hierarchical models of organizing, or et cetera, et cetera. That's not new, but anyway, back to the thought. But I think it's unfair at the same time. You're asking young people to do civil disobedience, do direct action. It's brutal. They are getting criminal records because of it. Young people in Palestine are ending up dead and in prison in order to fight these things. That is not a fair ask. I think that, there's many other things young people should be doing. So I'm always a bit nervous going, we should just let the young generation, inspire us and lead us. Actually, we have responsibility. I still slightly like to think of myself as the young generation, although I'm not quite sure where that ends.
Yeah, well, we could. I think we all think that. So how did you end up at COP26? What pushed you to spend time there?
I felt that it's what the moment required. It feels, especially as artists, we have a lot of skill sets that are very transferable to activism, direct action. Actually, sometimes I just think it is theatre. There's theatre happening inside COP and there's the theatre on the streets. And actually often, like, for example, one of the teams I worked with was the Stop Shopping Choir from New York. They're a choir. That is arts. So I feel like it's very much a place where artists should be. It's our responsibility. And also COP was happening in the UK. I think two things to really add is, first of all, doing stuff on the streets is not directly accessible. It's completely unfunded. I could go because I'm effectively on a writing grant and I just merge it all together. But, again, there's a question of, well, who can go and spend time when the train fare is extortionate, the accommodation went through the roof, and it's predominantly unfunded. There are systems, sleeping on floors. There's kind of like a mutual aid activist style network where people are helping each other. There's a lot of crowdfunding around projects. So I don't think it means you can only go if you've got a way to financially back it up. I do think there's really good alternative systems. And then the other thing that is super important to mention is that the police presence was brutal. And we know that police specifically target people of color. We know this. So again, being white adds a certain level of protection from that. It doesn't completely get rid of it. I mean, I spent 2 weeks just dealing with police shit, from them doing a dawn raid on a 40-foot Loch Ness monster that we'd spent quite a long time building, and really with no legal rights to do that. And they were sort of shouting, "Step away from the monster!" Like an inflatable Loch Ness monster. Actually, I was going to say like an inflatable Loch Ness monster is a huge crime, but they're literally saying it is. Being detained for an hour for cycling, police coming into the coffee shop being like, "You're about to commit a crime." Like, just drinking latte here. So I think that police presence is really tricky. It's an infringement of our democratic rights, and they also target very specific people, both the police and the criminal justice system. And so that's another huge barrier that needs to be acknowledged, and often isn't by climate movements. I hope that's getting better. I hope we've moved beyond the days of singing "We Love You, Police." But I think that really needs to be acknowledged. And I actually never quite remember. Let me just look it up because I forget what it's called. Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, that if it passes through Parliament is going to be really brutal on many areas, including our right to protest. And of course, street performance comes under that. So, things to watch out for.
So Zoe, how do you take that into the boardroom when you're talking round?
Badly.
But where do you start? Where would you start?
Oh, Keith, what a question to finish on. I've had two actually I've had three, but three boards I've been a part of. One long time ago. The second one I actually left because I felt that really basic things were not being considered, including the fact that every one of us in the room was white and I was the only woman, which kind of so directly and clearly affected the decisions being made. So I think sometimes we can walk out. On the board I'm on now, which is a board I really enjoy being on, it's about, building structures that support some of the things I'm talking about, including, embedding really good values and principles, which is something you kind of always have in activism. Actually, I think organizations need to start asking, what are our demands? I talk very openly and honestly about my life that involves things like, you kind of have to declare it anyway, but having a criminal record and trying not to sort of hide these types of things, which I can sometimes get away with, and just really trying to have upfront conversations. I think boards need to have activists, people, again, it's why I really want to talk about Zachariah. He's like as far from what we think of as someone you might have on board, but it's his leadership that's quite literally built the Freedom Theatre. So I think it's getting these people on. And one thing I think is really important is boards need to start supporting direct action and civil disobedience, because we know history tells us that this is one tactic that works for change, but it's just never something that's possible to talk about. And I often feel that, let's say I work a lot with the group BP or Not to BP, and largely we're facing the British Museum's board, who just double down on decisions rather than going, you know what, let's risk things, let's tear things up, let's try new things. I'm kind of rambling now, Keith. It's a hard question to answer. I think
it is
the environment I struggle the most in, and I also think it's okay not to always want to be in those environments. And I remember one person talked to me. We worked on this sort of alternative education tour in Glasgow, and she designed it, and it put together colonialism and Glasgow's history of slavery and polluters in the present day. And it was such a brilliant tour. And she just said, I didn't want to come to Glasgow and protest. I wanted to come and build something. And I think that's okay. We don't have to always be in those spaces. And I do believe that more and more we should start asking politely and actually reclaim space, occupy it, take it back.
Well, that's a challenge, isn't it? To kind of throw out to us all at the end of that session. There's lovely things in the chat where people are reflecting on what you've been saying, Zoe. So we'll pick it up. But I think there's a couple of just quick points before we conclude. Victoria says, how can we create change in a boardroom when we can't even come to a consensus? She's reflecting on what other speakers have been saying about COP26 and the role of the police there. But would you say, Zoe, that we don't actually have to worry so much about the consensus? We kind of got to that point where taking a stand is and not worrying so much about the consensus is a way forward?
I'm on a board I love, but I do slightly make a point of going, the democracy decides, but I don't agree. And that board is a really good board with a lot of different experiences. But the previous board, it was a very monolithic experience, which was why it's like nothing was going to shift, which sort of goes back to the point that unless there's people with lived experience, I hate that expression, but it's kind of a shorthand, and who are participating in diversity of tactics, and I mean from armed resistance through to super glue. I think it's really important to keep mentioning this, even though that's a bit tough in British contexts. I think that unless those people are there, then it's hard to get to a consensus that is the change that we need. And sometimes, and I say this as a, you know, white middle class person, actually it's just getting out the fucking way. You know, maybe sometimes that's standing up and taking a chance, but actually sometimes that's just going, I am not the right person right now. There are better people. And that's really tricky in a art system where there's a lot of instability and difficulty in just getting work and pay and all of these things, but it's vital.
Well, so the time has come to say, well, thank you for your vitality, and thank you for kind of sharing your experiences and hinting at that hope that you found.
I mean, and take everything I said, you know, with a pinch of salt. Who knows what will come out my mouth on a Thursday morning? I'll probably vastly regret half the things I said and disagree with myself for the rest of the day. So,
well, but we will celebrate that and work through it with you. That's really interesting to kind of put it out there and see how people react. So Zoe, thank you.
No,
and
thank
I'm
you
sure
all.
that's going to be something we'll all reflect on through the rest of the conference and beyond. It is lunchtime, and that means that perhaps, you know, taking a break from the screen needs to be the thing on people's list now. But there is the system allows networking for you to join with others that have been commenting through the chat. The expo's there to talk to people as well, and we all meet again for more sessions after lunch. So Zoe, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And, well, yes, hurrahs all round, and claps and all the rest we can do on these wonderful digital platforms to say thank you for your time.
Thank you, Keith. And should I stay on now or shall I go?
If you can stay,
okay, fine.
things being said, lovely things being said in the chat, which would be lovely. But if people need to go, then please do so, because I know time is precious, and most of us working from home with desktops, that I'm sure emails are being pinging left, right, and centre, or the importance of lunch, and it shouldn't be devalued either, should it? So all that's really
answering emails. It's really a wonderful world.
One of the things Zoe, one of the things I was reflecting on was that, again, that kind of, you know, when do you step back, when, you know, the next generation coming through, again, personally for me, yeah, the kind of things that have been said in around but the National Theatre have restaged The Normal Heart, and that's looking back to the 1980s and HIV/AIDS and that kind of development of that kind of, you know, politicization of the kind of HIV epidemic, and what does that mean now after we've gone through the kind of another viral pandemic? And again, that kind of younger generation that doesn't have that memory of it. It's really interesting talking to people who weren't part of it, and they kind of how they reflect on it now. And you're right, you know, it's like, is it too much of a responsibility to give to a young person to kind of take the baton on and to fight? But
I think that's why, like, I suppose this idea of like collective is so important, which is not meant as a kind of, I don't know if anyone's still here, I should probably shouldn't say this out loud, but I don't mean that as kind of like a, you know, liberal wet dream. I just mean that as in, like, there's so much different experiences, and together that's very strong. But I think that has to be done at the same time. It doesn't, it's sort of calling out racism and discrimination and all of these areas, or, you know, because it doesn't just mean we all sound hands together and sing to the police.
Yeah.
No singing to the police.
Yeah, that's off the list. And I live with people who were facing the police. Maggie Thatcher closing down the mines and all the rest of it, and that is part of their DNA. It is interesting sharing, their experience and to what they see happening at the moment.
And there's so much to learn from those experiences, or I've certainly learned so much from those experiences that people have told me about. So I think that's why it's important. And again, with this group of supporters in New York who were part of civil rights movement, like they used to turn around to me when I was like super young and working at the Freedom Theatre and just be like, well, you need to think about this, and you think about this. And I was like, oh, wow. And it's like, that was a real guidance for me, because they've lived through those things. And how amazing to have people who've experienced the civil rights movement with young actors from Palestine, with armed resistance from Palestine. Like, what a solidarity. And we've seen that when, between Black Lives Matter and Palestinian solidarity and Ferguson and Palestine, it makes it stronger. And is your writing project around that, or is that something slightly different? No, that's that. So it's looking at how, I suppose, the interconnection between armed resistance, civil disobedience, and culture. And it's not sort of, let's say, an intellectual thing, although I'll try and throw in the odd word of wisdom. But it's very much just talking about the stories of people I know, have worked with, and it's like, I don't know, it maybe it's just where I am in life that I just needed a bit of space to reflect. But I think there's so many incredible lessons to learn, let's say from the Syrian revolution, where the creative means were so brilliant. And, again, there was no time for it here, but a very interesting role between, let's say, the use of culture in uprising and a armed resistance group. It's this. And then also, often these things end or continue in really complex ways, and I think that's hard, especially with the Freedom Theatre. It's hard to get into like the complexities quickly. It's not all romanticism.
I'm really sorry, guys, we're going to have to wrap this up.
You have to wrap me up, Sarah,
yes, we're going to kick you out of here.
Steve keeps asking me questions. I'm like,
I know,
question answering mode.
No, it's so good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely stuff. Thank you, Zoe.
Shall I press leave now?
Go.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk more, but you just got me in the mood.
No, it's great. Thanks, everyone. See you later.